The Lord Sigmar sends me visions of hell. I see gigantic treadmills, eternally turning in the dark. I see uncountable masses of swarming vermin, standing on their hind legs in a foul parody of man. I see monstrous machines made by deranged mutants. I see bloated queens with atrophied limbs breeding their rotten offspring. All this I see. In my head, the dreadful tolling of the cursed bell still screams. The multitude of red eyes stare at us from the darkness of seas. Loathe us, and they will rise to devour us for all our sins. Make it stop. Please, make it stop. Erroneous Ocuyus of Tilly. Flanked by the albino guards of the Council of 13, not knowing whether he was a guest or a prisoner, Grey Seer Thanquol was marched roughly through the teeming streets of Skavenblight towards the shattered tower. Trying to control his accelerating heartbeat, he swallowed the saliva that filled his mouth, as it always did in moments of stress. He lashed his tail 3 times, so fiercely that even the huge white storm vermin stepped away from him. Good, he thought. At least they still showed him some respect. The crowds parted before the guards as if by magic. As they passed, even proud warriors in the livery of the Clan Lord's bodyguard stepped aside into the overflowing gutters and nodded obedience. Thanquol was somewhat reassured. Even if he was a prisoner, a possibility he wasn't prepared to admit, even to himself, then he could still inspire fear in the swarming population of the city. The constant press of bodies was everywhere. Skavenblight teemed with living occupants. They brushed against each other constantly, fangs bared in warning smiles. A scuttling tide of cowled and muffled ratmen moved through the city, rushing about on their own dark business. The palanquins of great lords drifted with the crowds, rising above the heaving mass of flesh like barges sailing on a river of fur. Here and there, vermin lay on the broken flagstones. Maybe they were asleep. Possibly they were dead. Thanquol did not care. Plenty more where they came from. Thanquol cared more for the time-eroded fountain, the one that still showed the vague outline of a human archer, more than he cared for any of his fellow Skaven. And he cared for that statue not at all. The clamour was almost deafening. Only the rumbling of the distant underground machines and the grinding of the great mills rose above the hubbub of twice 10,000 Skaven voices. They chittered in 100 different ways, angry squeaks, protestations of innocence, whines for mercy, and cries for attention all competed with each other. He breathed deeply, and took a lungful of the hot and humid air. It smelled of methane and rotting rubbish and the unwashed bodies of the crowd. The air carried the sweet scent of stagnant water and the sickly sweet tang of corruption to his sensitive nostrils. It was a reassuring scent that spoke of the presence of many of his people, of long occupation of this place by countless generations of Skaven. To Thanquol, It was the scent of home. He inspected his surroundings, trying to thrust aside the niggling suspicion that this might be the last time he would ever look upon them. In the murky mist, Skaven Blight was at its most attractive. The giant crumbling buildings loomed out of the fog. Ratmen swarmed through every ground floor and window. Great rotting oak supports groaned under the weight of the stonework they strained to support. Luminous fungus lit a path through the murk. Puddles glowing with phosphorant algae stained the cracked roadways. From every nook and cranny, Skaven watched them, their gazes predatory and filled with hunger. His escort carried naked blades, and this made Thanquol nervous. He had already been stripped of all of his weapons back in the Warren Chamber. Only the 13's chosen guards, mute albinos all, were allowed into the shattered tower carrying arms. And they were as loyal to their masters as it was possible for any Skaven to be. Thanquol knew this only too well. Many times he had tried to bribe or coerce one, always without success. They feared their masters more than they feared his sorcery, and he could not match the wealth that bought their loyalty. An idle speculation passed through Thanquol's mind. Did the council's guards dye their fur white, or did it turn white when they were inducted into the service of the 13? Perhaps the rumour was true, and they were all mutants purchased at vast expense from Clan Moulder. Thanquol dismissed this idea. It would give the Beastmasters too much power over the council members. Suppose they bred the guards to all attack on a spoken code word. The entire council could be wiped out in a single well-timed attack. Thanquol made another mental note to find out the cause of the albino rat's mutation. One could never tell when such information might be useful, or what other interesting avenues of exploration it might open. This was presuming he survived the coming interview, with the 13, of course. Which he would. Of this he had no doubt. True, the thought of encountering the dread rulers of his rat-like race filled the Grey Seer with dread, and he was no means a stranger to horror. The 13 were legendary for their cunning, and steeped in the blackest of evil. They were said to be immortal, the chosen of the Horned Rat himself, and familiar with the most dire and potent of sorceries. Each had achieved his place at the top of the Skaven society by virtue of ferocity, cunning, and many unspeakable acts. Each could only be replaced by being slain by a Skaven tougher than himself. Not one lord had been changed within the last 10 generations. The Lords of Decay were ruthless and wise, and they did not suffer failures gladly. Thanquol feared that they would, most unjustly, regard him as a failure. He pushed that thought aside. The business behind the man-city of Nuln had been a fiasco, but it was not his fault. His incompetent underlings were to blame, and of course that hell-spawned dwarf and his furless ally. May the Horned Rat gnaw on their putrid souls. All the council's aims would have been achieved if it had not been for them. Moreover, he suspected treachery somewhere within the ranks of his followers too. Hatred of his enemies and fear of the council warred in Thanquol's rotten soul. Hastily, he pushed both emotions aside. What did he have to fear? Was he not a Grey Seer, the most potent of mage rats, most cunning of the council's agents? Had he not passed through the 13 circles of initiation, and walked blindfolded through the maze of inevitable death? Had he not killed his own sorceress mentor and eaten his soul? Had he not outlived 3 generations since his birthing? Was he not responsible for some of the council's greatest successes in recent years? Thanquol allowed himself a well-deserved gloat. Had he not masterminded the assassination of the renegade plague lord Skratswick? And had he not brought the rebellious warlord Krasnik and his clan to heel? The thought of how he had tricked Krasnik and all of his advisors to a peace conference, and then set them at each other's throats with suspicions of treachery, still filled him with glee. Had he not ventured to Tilia in the man-cities, and won over the furless burgomasters to the Skaven cause by promising them power and eternal life? The witless fools had been only too willing to believe his sorcery. Had he not led the army that destroyed the Chaos Warband of Alaric Lionmane and his host when they threatened the council's holding in the north? And had he not personally defeated the necromancer Vorgun of Prague in single combat? Surely all these things must count for something in the council's judgment. True, there had been some minor setbacks. The burgomasters of Tilia had all mutated from the warpstone dust he had given them to consume, and they had been stoned to death by their fellow citizens. Alaric had only been stopped at the cost of the lives of every Skaven under his command. Vorgun had returned stronger than ever as a leech, and had sworn eternal enmity to the Skaven race for what he saw as their treachery. Yet these were only temporary stepbacks to the great plan. They were not failures. Only the most blind and idiotic could think of them as that. And the council were neither blind or idiotic. They would see his worth. Yes, they would. As they approached the shattered tower, Thanquol controlled the urge to squirt the musk of fear. He was a grey seer, mightiest of all the Skaven sorcerers, and he refused to be afraid. Yes, he refused to show fear, even in the face of the council's wrath. He was not afraid of the mere sight of their tower. The sight of its huge, crazily leaning mass did not fill him with dread. No, his limbs did not shake at the sight of it. Let other rats superstitiously avoid treading on the great tower's shadow. He was beyond that. He had ventured within the tower before, during his initiation, and he had not been afraid then. He let his mind drift back to those other happier days. The long-ago days when he had still been an untried, callow youth. He had not fought his way up from the lowest warren of Skaven blight to the heady heights of power by being a coward. He was brave and fierce. He had been the smallest and weakest of his litter, marked as different by the colour of his fur. By all rights he should have died in the murky, gaslit depths, eaten by his larger fellows, or killed in one of the many explosions or cave-ins that had claimed the others of his litter. Yes, he should have died, but he had not, for he had been chosen. His natural ferocity had more than made up for his lack of size, and his eerie grey colour had inspired fear as well as hatred in his fellows. His natural cunning enabled him to spring traps on those who had beaten him, and his natural intelligence and eloquence soon made him a leader among his birth king. No one had dared test his temper after that, not when he had a small army under his control. And there was more. He had not survived simply by being lucky and cunning and fierce. When the shivering earth had toppled the roof on his entire family's warren, some sixth sense had warned him to flee, and had guided him out along the one safe path of the collapsing tunnels. When the great powered carriages had crashed, killing all passengers, some instinct had warned him not to step aboard at the last second. Even when Clan Skyer agents had filled his clan's burrow with the poison wind, he had known in advance, warned by a dream, and he had fled through the sewers in safety. He had warned only those of his fellows who had shown him the greatest respect. His dreams had guided him to seek the council's agents. The horned rat had spoken to him and let him know he was one of the chosen. Thanquol had listened and ventured to the temple and joined all the other frightened young Skaven seeking entry to the Horned One's service. Within the temple, he had been confronted with the test of death. He had correctly divined which of the 13 doors to pass through, and walked with assurance into the sanctum of the Horned Rat, while the others had gone into the chambers of certain doom. The seers had known then that Thanquol was the real thing, genuinely touched by their lord's great paw, and they had welcomed him, even as they had tittered at the screams of the other failed candidates. As Thanquol and the albino guard stepped through the entranceway of the shattered tower, silence descended. The clamour of the city was cut off, as if by an invisible curtain. The air was cooler and tainted with damp. It reminded him powerfully of the day he had been brought to the Holy of Holies, the sacred site where the Horned Rat had manifested himself at the pleading of the Grey Seers and ended the Great Civil War nearly 200 years ago. He remembered the awe he felt when he looked upon the 13-sided pillar, bearing the 169 commandments inscribed by the Horned Rat himself. He had looked upon a relic of the only being in the universe that in his secret Skaven heart of hearts he was prepared to acknowledge as a being greater than himself. The masters of his order had not needed to make him abase himself before the pillar. He had spontaneously thrown himself to the ground in an ecstasy of adoration. Even in his frenzy, some instinct had warned him not to touch the rune-encrusted pillar. The masters had twitched their tails wisely, knowing that truly, indeed, he was one of the chosen. Then he had been only young. He had yet to be initiated into all the mysteries of his order. He had never tasted the warpstone snuff that sent delightful visions of carnage and death dancing through his brain. He had not yet learnt the secret rituals that would hone his powers, letting him tear away the veil of the future. He had not yet mastered the secret arts of divination that revealed the plotting of his foes to his razor-sharp mind, or those deadly spells that would enable him to slay entire armies of his enemies. Then he'd known nothing, but he had been young and quick-witted and keen to learn. Soon he had risen from apprenticehood. He had lived while others of his age had failed. The memory of the fates of the others who had been initiated at the same time as him often cheered him up in his darkest hours. Squiktat had gone truly mad after sneaking a look at Master Sleekit's hidden grimoires. He had run off capering and gibbering, froth blowing from his mouth. He had vanished into the swamps and was never seen again. Thanquol was glad that Squiktat had read the books. He too had been considering ransacking the Master's library. Boarhacker had devolved into a chaos spawn after consuming too much warpstone in battle with the orcs. It was a waste, for Borka had been malleable, and may have proven a fine agent for Thanquol. The brilliant Tisquick had been killed by a weeping blade, presumably wielded by a Clan Eshin assassin, the victim of one of the Council's indeterminable intrigues. Perhaps Seer Lord Christic feared that his protege may one day replace him on the Council and had him removed. From that day, Thanquol had been careful not to show too much ambition. As they made their way up the long, winding stairwell to the council chamber, Thanquol cursed, remembering all the times he had ascended these stairs in triumph. He had not always been disapproved of by the council. Well could he remember the early days when he first enjoyed their favour, when he had competed with and intrigued against his brother seers to get the choicest of missions. With a certain sense of triumph, he recalled being chosen as the council's messenger to the stronghold of Clan Eshin, beneath the land the humans called Cathay. There he had seen their strange pagoda temples and watched their killers training, and learned real respect for the skills of the assassin clan. He remembered being chosen to study the ways of humans, which was a great honour, for the council considered the fast-breeding race the greatest threat to the supremacy of the Under-Empire. True, they were incredibly stupid, but not as stupid as orcs. They were better sorcerers than the dying race of dwarfs, and far more numerous than the fading race of elves. But they were also malleable, and they would make good slaves once brought under the Skaven lash. Thanquol had masterminded many Skaven assaults upon them. As well as corrupting the Tillian burgomasters, he had organised the mutant rebellion in Muslion, in the land of Bretonnia. He had overseen the reopening of the old rivalry between the temples of Ulrich and Sigmar. The council had been most pleased with him then, rewarding him with the services of his rat ogre bodyguard, Bone Ripper. Curse that impotent and treasonable spawn of Clan Mulder. He almost caused Thanquol's death by his incompetence. Thanquol had always suspected that rat ogres were bad luck. It had been so close. Ultimate success had almost been within his claws. He had almost sent the Empire, the mightiest of human states, tumbling into civil war. That should have been his greatest moment. His human pawn, von Hallstatt, would have been assassinated by the Emperor's brother. The killing of such a man by the Elector of Nuln's chief of secret police would have brought war between the mighty city-state of Nuln and the Emperor's forces. It would have been a war that would have fatally weakened both sides, and left the way clear for a Skaven invasion of the surface world. And so it should have been. Instead, it had all gone wrong. Horribly wrong. Von Hallstatt had been killed by some manling. Before Thanquol and Bone Ripper could interfere and save von Hallstatt, Bone Ripper had been killed by the Manlin's dwarf companion, and Thanquol had been forced to make a prudent withdrawal. After that, he had done his best to save the situation. He totally denied those evil souls who whispered that he merely sought revenge on the dwarf for his humiliation. It simply wasn't true. He was too clear-sighted for that. The invasion of Nuln had been a finely calculated move. It should have worked. In keeping with his plans, his minions had emerged in the Elector's palace in the middle of the grand ball. With one lunge, he held all of the city's leaders in his claw, and he could have forced them to do his will. Yet again, he had been thwarted by the cursed pair, and by the incompetence of his underlings. Who would have thought the Manling would have swayed a crowd of humans to attack the palace? Who would have thought that he and the dwarf would have fought their way into the ballroom and freed the nobles? After that, Thanquol had no option but to order the full-scale invasion of the city. It had been a perfectly rational decision. In no way had it been taken in anger or rage, as some of his enemies had whispered. The timing had been right. The humans were taken off guard by the appearance of so massive a Skaven force in their midst. It still filled his heart with pride to remember that huge army of ratmen moving through the sewers. They had been an all but invincible horde. The disorganized humans could not stand against the fanatical plague monks of Clan Pestilence. They had been slain in droves by the fiendishly cunning war machines of Clan Skyer, and they had been driven back from behind their barricades by the poison-winged Globadiers. His army had been invincible. For an hour, the howling, frothing horde had rampaged through the city of Nuln. The city would have fallen in mere hours, had not the cursed dwarf set light to the quarter of the city into which his army had emerged, forcing them to flee into the waiting army of humans who lurked beyond the blaze. It could have almost been a well-prepared ambush, though Thanquol doubted any human had the wit to prepare it. Now, more than ever, he suspected treachery. Skaven casualties from the blaze had been immense, but the devastation to the human side had been equally immeasurable. It had been an immense setback to the race of man. Viewed in the correct light, the mission had been a success. Absolutely, definitely a success, and that's what he would tell the council. They stood now before two great black doors, bearing the sign of the Horned Rat. Beside the door was an immense brass gong. As Thanquol watched, a gigantic rat ogre smote the gong, and a single terrifying note rang out. Moved by some invisible agency, the doors swung open to reveal the Council of the 13. Thanquol breathed deeply, and began the exercises that old Sleekit had taught him to control his racing heart. Forcing one clawed foot ahead of the other, he walked into the chamber, straining his keen and far-seeing eyes to pierce the gloom. The chamber was vast and circular and barely lit. A huge hemispherical stone die ran across one edge of the room. On it was a gigantic podium draped in red and black. Behind the podium were 13 chairs. Some of the chairs were occupied, others were empty. It was hard to make out any details of the chamber's occupants in the dim light. Behind each chair, the sign of the Horned Rat was repeated. In front of each chair, a banner bearing the symbol of the occupant clan or faction was draped. All the walls were covered in great red tapestries. As Thanquol walked forwards, an eerie green spotlight picked out a point on the centre of the floor. It fell directly on the great circle where the symbol of the Horned Rat was once more etched onto the floor. Thanquol knew without being told that he was expected to stand there. He walked over calmly, fighting down the urge to turn and flee, resisting the even greater urge to reveal his teeth in a smile of anger. The black hunger tore at his stomach, and he knew at that moment he was prepared to fight even the Council of 13, if need be. The floor creaked under his weight, and he felt sure that this section was hollow and unstable. From below him came the faint smell of fetid water, and something else. Something reptilian. He was certain that he heard the sound of distant splashing, and a hiss. So, it was true. The Council did have a secret device here. He had heard dire rumours that they used a pit trap to drop those who had displeased them into a pool of starved, mutated monsters, some hideous hybrid of Skaven and crocodile. He wondered how long it would be before he knew the exact truth. He stood, squinting on the spotlight. Now, with the light in his eyes, he could definitely see nothing. The figures on the chairs were mere shadowy shapes. He knew he would be at a terrible disadvantage if he had to fight. He was a sitting target for missiles or spells, while he could aim at nothing. He decided swiftly that fighting was impractical. Whatever his fate was, it was sealed.
Greetings, Gracie Thanquol,
said a voice, rich and deep and steeped in old evil.
Yes, greetings,
said other voices. Some were thin and reedy, so weak to be almost inaudible. Others were deep enough to come from the throats of trolls.
Greetings and congratulations.
Thanquol's voice almost broke as he replied. He fought to keep it from squeaking.
Greetings, great and mighty lords of decay. We wish to talk to you about your recent actions in the man-city of Nuln.
I can explain, interrupted Thanquol.
My wretched underlings.
No need to be modest,
Gracie Thanquol. The responsibility for the plan was all yours. No. It was a minor setback, that's all. I can rectify the situation.
No need. The man-city is half in ruins, and the warriors of Clan Scab are reduced to 1/10 of their former strength. No longer are they a threat to the council.
Swiftly, Thanquol made some calculations. He saw a flash of light at the end of the tunnel.
They planned rebellion.
He tried to make it sound halfway between a statement and a question.
Yes, Gracie Thanquol. Now they plan no more. Commendations to you. We have another mission for you. One of greatest importance. To aid you, we have contracted a new bodyguard.
Thanquol tried to examine the situation from all angles. It seemed unlikely that the council believed he had known of Clan Scab's treachery when he had not. They were too well informed for that. Yet it must suit the purposes of some of them to pretend that he had purposely destroyed Clan Scab. Perhaps the clan had been under the patronage of one of the Lords of Decay who had planned a move against the council. If that was the case, the open admission that someone had moved against the council would start another disastrous civil war. No one on the council wanted that. Therefore, it suited them to pretend he had foiled the conspiracy all by himself. And was it not true, in a way? Thanquol felt himself puff up with pride. Another thought struck him. His mission had been sabotaged to make sure it failed. He was now certain of it. As he suspected, all along, his meticulous plans had been spoiled by the treachery of another. As the council outlined his mission, thoughts to turn to schemes of revenge. First, he must find his hidden enemy, and then he also decided that he would call his new bodyguard Bone Ripper, in tribute to his loyal and trusted and sadly deceased follower. Yes, Thanquol had always suspected rat ogres brought good luck.